Amen. Well, good morning again, church. If you have a Bible with you, I'd love for you to open that up with me to the book of Revelation, chapter 12. Okay, maybe we weren't expecting that in an Advent series, but we're going for it. Okay, so Revelation chapter 12, we'll read that in a minute. But if you were here with us last week, you'll know that we were into our 3-week series on Advent. Remember, Advent is our English word that comes from the Latin word adventus. And essentially, Advent, we're celebrating it. Advent means coming or arrival. And so during the season of Advent, we are learning to long, as we saw last week, learning to kind of groan as we look at the darkness around us, as we look back at the first coming of Jesus, and then look forward to his second coming, right? So in Advent, we are learning to groan for that as we look back at Jesus' first coming and look forward to his second coming. So last week, I kind of suggested to you that as Christians, one of our postures in this world should be that of kind of eager yearning or groaning as we wait for redemption to be accomplished, right? This eager longing and yearning for the eradication of evil in the world and in our hearts. And so that's where we were last week, and I hope that this week provided you some opportunity to practice that, to learn, to long for redemption, to look forward to that. And this morning, we're going to be looking back at the first coming of Jesus from maybe a little bit of a different perspective than what you are used to at this time of the year. Now, I don't know about you, but one of the things that I've noticed over the years is the way that sometimes we've domesticated Christmas a little bit, haven't we? You know what I mean by that? When I say domesticated, I mean that we've kind of tamed it down a little bit and cleaned it up a little bit and made it a little bit more palatable. We've taken this unique message of Christianity and kind of sanded it down, the rough edges, so that it's been adapted to be celebrated as a holiday by secular and religious alike. Even the way, if you think about it, even the way we talk about the birth of Jesus has this kind of romanticized aura about it. It feels almost like this fairy tale. And so, for example, we sing song lyrics around this time in the Christmas season like, "A silent night, holy night, all is calm and all is bright." And another song that says, "The baby awakes, but no crying he makes," right? So even in our singing, we're looking at the situation of Jesus' birth, and we're led to believe that it was just this blissful, kind of quiet, perfect, peaceful, idyllic setting. Now, I've got 3 children, and so I know that night was probably a little bit less peaceful and blissful than we often make it out to be, if you know what I mean, right? Like there's probably a little more pain happening there. It's probably a little messier than what we are used to talking about. But sometimes it's the case that when you and I hear something regularly, as we have with the Christmas story, it becomes so familiar that we almost begin to tune it out, don't we? We kind of hover above what's going on, and I know I can certainly catch myself doing that times, but we have what you could say is a been there, done that attitude. Heard this before, and we kind of tune it out, and just kind of what happens then is we end up focusing on the things that are actually not the most important thing, if you know what I mean. So what's foundational to the Christmas season for Christians then becomes kind of an add-on, and then what's actually fluff or unnecessary becomes the most important part of the season. Now, don't get me wrong, the decorations and family time and celebrations are all good things. We've had a Christmas tree up in our house for a week. We've got Christmas music playing in the background. But I think we'd agree that these good things aren't the essence of what we remember in the Advent season and during Christmas celebrations. And so I think if we're honest with ourselves, we probably agree that we're always, as Christians, going to be fighting this temptation towards thinking about this season as one that's primarily about general good feelings and warm vibes. You know what I mean? Like we have this feeling that Christmas is just about fireplaces and like twinkling lights and warm settings and family and friends, and just have this feeling that Christmas is about this good feeling or this warm vibes that we get. So here's what I want to do this morning. This isn't the first time you've probably heard a preacher railing against this, and it's probably not going to be the last time. But here's what I want to do this morning. As we're in this Advent season, learning to yearn for Jesus as we remember his first coming and look forward to his second coming, I want to try to restore for us some of the grittiness, if I could say that, of the Christmas story, if that's fair. I want to remind us that underneath all of these things that surround our holiday season here in the West, sparkling lights, fireplaces, whatever else comes with that season, is the reality that God joined us in the mess to redeem us from the mess. right? To understand that beneath all of these things lies this a rather scandalous and disturbing story if we allow ourselves to get into it and understand it fully. So that's where we're going this morning, and we're doing that from Revelation chapter 12. So open your Bible with me, and I'm going to read from verse 1 down to verse 5 together. Revelation 12, 1 to 5. It says this, "And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains in the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But the child was caught up to God and to his throne, and the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days." Now, I'm sure, church, as I read this passage, some of us in this room are going, what is going on here, right? What is this? What are we reading? Is this crazy? Because we've got a woman adorned with sun and a moon under her feet and a wreath of 12 stars in her head, and we've got a 7-headed dragon ready to eat a baby. Like, what is going on in this passage here? Now, as modern readers, right, in the year 2020, this feels strange and foreign to us. But in the first century, actually, this type of literature wasn't uncommon. In fact, there are a number of books and parts of books in the Old Testament that fall into this genre. We would call it apocalyptic literature, okay? Actually, the book of Revelation is more than just that. It's also a letter, right? It's a letter written to churches. It's also a prophecy, but most of it is what we would call apocalyptic. You can see that in the Old Testament, but the word apocalyptic, I know we have all kinds of associations with that from movies and films and ideas about it, but essentially it just means to reveal or to unveil, okay? So apocalypse or apocalyptic just means revealing or unveiling. And so what we find in this type of literature is the unveiling or revealing of things or events that might be otherwise hidden to our human eyes. So it opens up our eyes to see events that are happening kind of behind the scenes, behind the curtain. So the book of Revelation helps us to understand that for all that's going on that we can perceive with our eyes, there are real events. There is a real world that's happening behind that as well. And so it feels strange and foreign to us, but it wouldn't have been strange and foreign to readers in the first century. So our job is to seek to understand what is conveyed in these messages and in these symbols. So as we look at this short passage, there's a lot going on here, but essentially what we're looking at is a different sort of nativity scene, okay? Now, I want a quick show of hands. We'll get some participation here. Last time I checked, we were still allowed to raise our hands, okay? So here's a question for you. How many of you have a nativity scene in your house, whether that's like a set of figurines or some kind of picture or something like that set up right now? How many? Okay, so that's a decent amount. I'm gonna wager, I guess, at 50%. Here's my next question. In how many of your nativity scenes is there a 7-headed red dragon? Anybody? Okay, someone raised their hand, but I think that's a joke. So nobody, right? None of us have this. This is different than what we're used to. Most of our nativity scenes, we kind of see this kind of peaceful, blissful set where Mary and Joseph are kneeling beside the manger and baby Jesus is sleeping there. He's not crying. He's not making any noise. And yet Revelation is saying that behind all of that, there is a different scene. Okay, there are other things going on. There is a dragon there, and we see the picture of this woman and all these things going on. Now, by the way, if you're still looking for a gift for others, there are lots of incomplete nativity sets in this room. So if you could find a 7-headed dragon, that would just complete the set for your friend or family member, make a great Christmas gift. But here's what I'm saying. So in these 5 verses, we've got 3 main characters. And so what I want to do this morning is just walk through these main characters and figure out who they are and what this passage is trying to say about them. And then after that, we'll just kind of sum things up and asking, what does this mean for us as the church? How does this help us in this Advent season? So let's look at character number 1, the woman in verse 1. It says this, "And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains in the agony of giving birth." So immediately in verse 1, we're told that John saw a great sign in heaven. Now, The Greek word here that's translated sign is the same word that John uses in his gospel, in John's gospel that we've been working through. And it's essentially, a sign is a symbol that points to something else, right? In other words, the signs aren't the point, but the reality that they point to are the point. So this is one of the reasons we've got to be careful as we read the book of Revelation, that we don't get caught up too much in the vivid imagery that the book uses, because these are meant to convey something real that's happening, right? Something about the real world. We can't miss that. And so the first sign that John sees is a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and she's wearing a crown of 12 stars. And not only is she arrayed in this kind of grandeur, but she's also pregnant and crying out in birth pain. So she's about to have a child. So what's going on here? Well, here's the first question we need to ask is, who is this woman? Who is this woman? Now, at first glance, our most natural response would say, well, of course, this is a nativity scene, and spoiler alert, we are going to say later that the child being born is Jesus. We know that. So obviously, the woman here is Mary, the mother of Jesus. However, there's a number of reasons why we probably shouldn't think that that's not an appropriate answer. Rather, most likely, the woman is symbolic of the nation of Israel, of whom Mary is one small part. Now, here's what I mean by that. I want you to think with me of this image of the woman. She's clothed with the sun, and the moon is under her feet, and there's a crown of 12 stars on her head. And I want to ask you, does that picture of the sun and moon and 12 stars remind you of anything from the Old Testament? You see, these symbols are included to help give us a clue as to what is intended here. So some of you who know your Old Testament really well may be reminded of a famous story from the book of Genesis. In Genesis 37, verse 9, where Joseph has a dream. Do you remember the dream where the sun and the moon and the 11 stars, his 11 brothers, bow down to him, right? And this is one of the dreams that kind of kickstarts his brothers' antagonism towards him. They sell him into slavery, and that dream ends up coming true as his brothers later approach him as the second in command over all of Egypt, begging for food, right? Now, essentially, the 11 stars in that story are the brothers of Joseph. They are the 11 tribes of Israel. And so in this scenario, we have 12 stars, which refers to the fullness of God's people, the 12 tribes of Israel. And so what's being conveyed here is that this woman represents faithful Israel, God's people, and she is in the pains of childbirth. Now, it's also interesting to note that in several places in the Old Testament, Israel is also referred to as a pregnant woman who is in the pains of childbirth. It's actually lines up with the passage we looked at last week really well in Romans chapter 8, where Paul talked about the creation groaning in the pains of childbirth, longing for redemption. And often in the Old Testament, you see Israel portrayed this way as they wait for the Messiah. Right, there's this groaning and there's this anguish as they wait for the dawning of light in the darkness. And so we see that same type of idea present here in this faithful Israel, this woman who's giving birth to a child. So that's sign number one, the faithful people of God, Israel. Sign number two, look with me at verse 3. It says this, "And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it." So pause for a second. Here's the second sign, a great red dragon. The color red is likely intended to symbolize his murderous intent. He has 7 heads, 10 horns, and on his heads are diadems that represent the false authority that he has. They represent his claim to authority over and against the King of Kings. So another question, who is this great red dragon? 7 heads, 10 thorns, all these crowns. What's going on here? Well, we know the answer to that question because actually a few verses later, in Revelation chapter 12, verse 9, John tells us this. It says, "And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world." So now it becomes clear for us that this red 7-headed dragon is the serpent from Genesis, the early chapters of Genesis. He is the devil and Satan, and he is the deceiver of the whole world, the one who tempted Eve in the garden, and who is responsible ultimately for all of the sin and evil that has been unleashed in God's good world. Now, by the way, isn't it interesting how verse 9 describes him as the deceiver of the whole world? I don't know about you, but when we think about Satan and his tactics against the church, I think sometimes we often think of these grand things that he might be trying to accomplish. But we often forget that one of Satan's most effective weapons against the church is the simple act of deceiving people, leading them away from what is true. In other words, Satan accomplishes his purposes by getting people to believe lies about themselves, about others, and about the world instead of believing in what is true. And here's why that's such an effective strategy, because when you've been deceived, you don't know it, right? When we've been deceived, we don't know. We think that we are clinging to what is true. We think that the things that we are holding fast to do align with ultimate reality, and so we build our lives around them, and we have no way of knowing that we've actually been tricked into believing something that is actually a lie. In the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 44, Jesus says this to the Pharisees. I love this. He says, "You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him." Listen to this. "When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies." Isn't that interesting? So Jesus is saying that when the devil lies, he speaks his native language, because at his core being, he is a liar. There is no truth in him. So you and I speak English. If someone here is German, you would speak German. If you're Spanish, you would speak Spanish. If you are French, you would speak French. Jesus is saying that the devil is a liar and therefore he lies. That's all he knows how to do, is to deceive and trick and to lead people astray. I don't know about you, but I think we could all agree that there are so many destructive lies floating around in our world today that deceive people and threaten to lead us away from the truth. Which means that for you and I as followers of Jesus and as Christians who believe the truth and who believe in Jesus who is truth, that one of the most important things that we can learn how to do in this world is to speak the truth in love, right? To speak the truth in love, not in a way that's condemning or shaming others, but in love and care for their greatest well-being. We speak that truth. Now, I want you to notice, as we get back in the text here, what it says in verse 4. John tells us that this red dragon, 7 heads, 10 horns, and crowns, stands before the woman so that when her child is born, he might devour it. So we get this kind of violent picture of the type of conflict that exists between the dragon and the coming child. Now, again, spoiler alert, we know that the child is referring to Jesus. We'll get there in a second. So when we see the devil essentially waiting to devour Jesus upon his birth, doesn't it help make sense of so much of Jesus' life for us? Right? Like, it helps us to understand that behind all of the conflict that Jesus faced, there was a spiritual battle taking place. So for example, sometimes I think we forget this, but in many ways, the events surrounding Jesus' birth were anything but peaceful and quiet and blissful, right? Because not only were Mary and Joseph forced to give birth in a room that housed animals, but Matthew's gospel tells us that sometime after that, right, when Herod learns that a Messiah is born, he sends his men out to kill all of the male babies 2 years under in Bethlehem and the surrounding region. Like think about the violence and the chaos and the upheaval that would have come from that as Herod sends out his men into the village, and they're just going house to house finding children 2 years and younger in order to kill them. And the only way that Jesus survives that is that Mary and Joseph are warned in a dream that this is coming, so they flee to Egypt to escape the genocide that is taking place in that region. Right? So there's just this violence and conflict that marked Jesus' life from the early days. Now, we could keep going. We can see this in Matthew chapter 4 in Satan's temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. Right? Where Satan approaches Jesus, trying to lead him off his mission, trying to lead him astray, to turn away from what God had planned to do, trying to get Jesus to bow the knee to him, to give authority over to Satan instead of the authority that belonged with Jesus. And then we can ultimately see this in Jesus' crucifixion, right? The Gospel of Luke in 22 verse 3 says that Satan entered into the heart of Jesus before he betrayed him. Right? So behind the greatest betrayal in the history of the world, Satan is kind of deceiving and lying, and he's trying to orchestrate things to work against Jesus and his purposes. So this helps explain for us all of the violent opposition that faced Jesus throughout his life. Now, if we're honest, this shouldn't really be surprising to us, because actually in the first chapters of the Bible, we're told that this conflict, in fact, will be the case. And so in Revelation 12, when we see the image of the woman who is Israel giving birth to a son, and we see this son, this offspring in conflict with this dragon, we know who we know is the serpent. I think we should probably be thinking about the promise of Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. We looked at this a few weeks ago, where God promises that he will put enmity between you and the woman that is the serpent who deceived her, and between your offspring and her offspring. Right, so as soon as sin is unleashed in the world and God is cursing the serpent for his role in that, one of the things he says to him is that there will be enmity, there will be this conflict happening between the offspring of the woman, Eve, and the offspring of the serpent in the days and in the years to come. Now, certainly we know that there was this conflict with the nation of Israel, but that certainly comes to a head in Jesus Christ. Now, we'll come back to that in a minute, but that is our second character, the great red seven-headed dragon. Now, but here's the good news. Look with me at verse 5. It says that this woman, she gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Now, we know, I've said this already, we know that this child is referring to Jesus. Some commentators will try and look at this and say, no, it's not Jesus. I think the child is actually the church. But the language that's used of him here makes it clear that this is the Son of God and no one else. Here's what I mean by that. When John says in verse 5, that she gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with the rod of iron. He's essentially quoting from what's called the Septuagint. Okay, I don't know if you are familiar with that term, but the Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Old Testament that a lot of the biblical authors would have used as they were writing these scriptures. And so essentially he is quoting from Psalm chapter 2, which is a clear messianic psalm which speaks of the begotten Son who will have the nations as his heritage and the ends of the earth as his possession, and who will rule over them with the rod of iron. So clearly, that is pointing to the Messiah who is to come in many ways. And clearly, John in the book of Revelation is picking up that language to let us know that this child in this picture is in fact Jesus, the Son of God, the promised one of Israel. And friends, this is where the Christmas story begins to transform a little bit for us from a cute kind of inspirational feel-good story to a history-altering event where the very Son of God takes on flesh and tabernacles among us, to use the language of John in his gospel, not so that we can have these good feelings and warm vibes, but as the decisive act of war against the kingdom of darkness and all that is evil in the world. So one of the things that we celebrate at Christmas is the radical idea that the baby born in Bethlehem is the true king over the entire world. And this is why we sing songs that say, Jesus, Lord at thy birth. And born a child and yet a king. Right? That the baby wrapped in swaddling cloths is actually the true king over the entire universe. Now, it seems, back to Revelation 12, like a little bit of a hopeless situation, doesn't it? Here's this child, the promised Messiah, being birthed out of the nation of Israel, and a seven-headed dragon is waiting for him to devouring. And yet we read this in the next line. It says, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Now this line is like a huge understatement, because essentially this encapsulates all of Jesus' life. It kind of skips over his death and resurrection and jumps right to his ascension up to the throne of his Father. John is brief here, but the point of all of this, of course, is that the dragon has failed miserably at his task. The dragon, Satan, in all of his attempts to push aside Jesus, to kill Jesus, to throw him off his mission, he has failed miserably. Herod could not murder him, the devil could not persuade him, and the grave could not hold him. And Jesus, the resurrected king, has now taken his rightful place on the throne. This is why John is communicating this to us. He's been caught up to the throne of his Father. And Satan has, in an ultimate sense, already been defeated. We know that he is still active in our world, blinding the eyes of unbelievers. He's prowling like a lion, seeking to steal, kill, and destroy, and to deceive us, to lead us away from the truth. But his time is short, which is what John will tell us in a few verses. His time is coming. Because the ultimate victory over sin and evil has already been won in the crucifixion and in the resurrection of Jesus. And one day he's going to come back and finish the job. And it will be over for good. So here's the question I want to ask us this morning, church. How does this nativity scene help shape the way we think about Advent or Christmas? What does this mean for us as a church now? How does this guide us or direct us? Well, there's a few things, and we're going to close with this. The first thing I would say is it reminds us, this nativity scene reminds us that there is a battle going on. Yes, we could say it like this: Christmas is war. It's war not on flesh and blood, but on the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. And the reality is that you and I are caught up in that and called to play a part. Right? Christmas is not a cute story that inspires us, but rather is about the arrival of the true king who will make war on the spiritual forces of darkness and who will one day reign as king over all. Right? This is an all-out assault. The baby in the manger is an all-out assault on the kingdom of darkness. Now, I want to talk about this for a second because one of the things that we see the book of Revelation doing here is kind of, again, pulling back the curtain for us, letting us see what's going on, that there's more going on than what we can see with our eyes, right? Now, the reality is that you and I live in a secular world, which means that most of the people we interact with believe a worldview that says something like this: all that really exists is what we can kind of see and touch and feel. And the whole universe is here just because of a product of time and chance. Right? Essentially, there's this matter and time and chance, and everything just kind of ended up happening, and all the things that we think and feel are just chemical processes going on. There's not really any real meaning going on there, right? So we live in a secular world. So when we think about things like spiritual warfare or the spiritual realities that the Bible speaks about as being true and going on around behind us, behind the scenes, our tendency is to kind of question whether that can be really happening, right? We are tempted, like our world, to consider that the only things that are actually happening are what we can see with our eyes. And as Christians, we fall prey to this as well. Yes, on the other hand, sometimes Christians can go overboard and get distracted and preoccupied with these things, but my experience is that most of us live our lives as if this isn't happening. In many ways, we live as secular people, giving little to no thought to all that's happening in our world. Imagine a young child, right, playing in a field or pasture, picking daisies, all the while not knowing that she's standing in a minefield and that there are armies on either side of her, right? Just kind of clueless to the battle that's raging around us. And so many of us live our days as if that's all that's happening. And so I just this morning want to reaffirm here for our church, as followers of Jesus, as Christians, we believe that there is more going on in our world than what meets the eye. And that this is why Paul can say in Ephesians chapter 6 that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Now, this means that there will be people in our world who oppose the gospel, oppose the church, oppose Jesus, and yet Paul can say that ultimately our battle is not against them, because behind that opposition, something else is going on. Behind that is a deceiver and a liar who is leading people away from what is true. So that this is what we are called to do battle against as Christians. We're not fighting corrupt politicians. We're not fighting against hostile opponents, but we are fighting against spiritual forces of evil, to use the language of the New Testament. So Revelation chapter 12 reminds us in a season where we might want to forget it, that we are in a battle daily, a battle for what is true and for what is good and for what is right. Now, second, it reminds us that Jesus is victorious, and that therefore all who are in him are victorious as well, right? So amidst all of the vivid pictures in Revelation and the even crazier sometimes interpretations that we find coming out of this book, we often forget that this book was written to churches in the first century. It was written to real people on the ground, and it was written to churches who were experiencing intense persecution. There was so much going on in their lives, so much chaos and darkness, and to those churches, John wrote to remind them that Jesus is victorious in the end, and therefore, if they remain faithful to him, they will be victorious also. And in fact, this picture that we get in the book of Revelation is the same one that we get in the rest of the New Testament, namely that Jesus will conquer every spiritual enemy, and in the end, he will be victorious. So in Genesis 3:15, right, the passage that we just looked at, I love this. The promise goes on to say, so it says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between her offspring and yours. And then he says, he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. In other words, in Genesis 1 is saying that the seed of the woman, this offspring of Eve, in this perpetual conflict with the serpent, will receive a blow, but in the end will deal the decisive blow. That is to say that there is a day coming when someone from the line of Eve will crush the serpent and restore the goodness of the garden to the whole world. And this is Jesus. The New Testament is clear that this Jesus has been raised up over every other power. So for example, Ephesians 1:20-23 speaking about what God does, that God raised him from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly places, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, and above every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the one to come. And he put all things under his feet and gave him his head over all things to the church. It's Ephesians 1. So Jesus is above every other spiritual force or power in the world, and everything has been placed under his feet. 1 Corinthians 15, 25 to 27. Then comes the end, when he delivers the kingdom to God the Father after destroying every rule and every authority and power, for he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death, for God has put all things in subjection under his feet. Right in Colossians chapter 2, we hear about Jesus canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross, and he disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. So again and again throughout the pages of Scripture, we get this picture of Jesus as being victorious over all other things. And I think if you are like me at all in difficult and uncertain times like we're living in right now, we need to be reminded of this, don't we? We need to be reminded of the fact that Jesus is victorious, that the right person is in control, that Jesus is on his throne. And we know that because we belong to him, whatever happens in this life, we know that we will be victorious in the end. We are not defeated. And this just gives us a really unique opportunity to live out our hope in the world, doesn't it? Like where there's so much despair going on, so much temptation, just kind of despair the circumstances and be hopeless. We get to rise up as lights who've been filled with the Spirit of God and say, there is victory coming for those who are in Jesus, and my hope is in that alone. You could take away my job, you could take away all of the things around us, and yet we know that we will be victorious one day because Jesus has defeated the grave, he has triumphed over Satan and all of his rulers, and he is making all things new. It's a beautiful, beautiful opportunity for us to live out that in our world. Finally, church, this nativity scene reminds us that Jesus must not be trivialized. We must come to terms with Jesus not as the baby in a cute story, but as the coming king, as the one who reigns over all things and who has come to reclaim all that is lost in the world, to bring everything underneath his reign and rule. He will not be trivialized. Listen to this quote that one writer said. He said, "As long as we can keep him in the manger and feel the sentimental feelings we have for babies, Jesus doesn't disturb us. But once we understand that his coming means for every one of us either salvation or condemnation, he disturbs us deeply." And then he would go on to say, only those who have been so profoundly disturbed to the point of deep repentance are able to receive the tidings of comfort, peace, and joy that Christmas proclaims. Isn't that true? Right? That there's a sense that as long as we stop at Jesus in the manger and stop at the Christmas story as an inspirational story, we can kind of contain him and control him. But as we come to terms with this baby born to rule over the nations with a rod of iron, who is king over all, who is enthroned over all things, then we realize that it demands something from us, some type of response from us. That Jesus will not be trivialized. He calls us to repentance. He calls us to turn from the ways that the lies of the serpent have infected our hearts, and he calls us to turn from the part that we have played in all the evil and wickedness in the world. And it's only when we've been so disturbed towards repentance that we can really then receive the peace and comfort and joy that mark the Christmas season. Now, friends, here's the good news, the best news that we all need to be reminded of. Jesus is the King who dies for his enemies. Right, as the Son of God who comes to reclaim the lost world, we stand in his way, right, in open rebellion. Romans 5 says that we were enemies of God, far from him in every way, working against his purposes, turning our back on him. And yet it says that while we were still enemies, Christ died for us. See, Jesus' response to rebellious sinners like you and I is not to take our lives, but instead to give his for ours. So yes, the baby born in the manger came as king, but he comes as the suffering king who provides forgiveness through his death. So you and I now are welcomed into this kingdom. It's the most beautiful news in the entire world.